the readings are the ones that we can use in the class. But really, it's background more, and we'll build on that book. So we are going to do a series of 6 weeks, and then another 6 weeks, another 6 weeks, six weeks times 6. We're going to do the first 6 weeks. We're going to focus on how the sages of the Talmud and the Mishnah understood and read the biblical text. And this form of reading is commonly called Midrash. Now, the challenge is that Midrash is both a technique and it's also a body of work. So if you're talking about the technique of Midrash, the word Midrash means to seek, to search. So in many ways, it would parallel what people would call today a close reading of the text. Reading the text very carefully. One of the methods of biblical interpretation is omnisignificance, that every word has meaning. There's nothing here that's extra. It is being read as a collective whole, that all the 24 books of the Bible are reflecting one upon the other. The books of the Bible, from the traditional perspective, despite the fact that they are written over 1,000 years, are seen as one corpus, one canon, but each one hyperlinked to the other. In other words, you could find verses in Psalms attributed to King David that will illuminate something that Adam and Eve are talking about in the Garden of Eden. These texts, in other words, not just context. Normally, when you do a close reading, the closer you are in the context is where it's going to find relevance. In traditional reading of the Torah, we will jump around. Now, where we're going to go as we swim through this sea of commentary and interpretation, we're going to move towards a readings of the text that are closely aligned with the text itself. What I mean to say is that Jewish tradition will link everything to the Tanakh, everything to the 24 books of the Bible, everything to the 5 books, philosophy, medicine, ethics, law, will all be linked back to the text. But what we're going to try to do is we're going to go down through the path of Jewish law and not through the path of the sermons of the Midrash, which are ethical, moral teachings that are less related to the text, but rather we're going to try to see how the reading of the biblical text, how these different stages, different approaches looked at it. Any thoughts before? I'm going to open up a few different windows here at the same time. I'm using the vision of a computer here. But in other words, a few other windows I want to open up at the same time. Any thoughts before I jump into another? Okay, here's another. When it comes to rabbinic interpretation of the biblical text, there are different coexisting methods of interpretation. So one that's very common, legal, a legal one. Legal is, what is the law? You shall bind them to sign upon your hand. What does that mean? Where in your hand? Oh, next to your heart, upon your heart, on your arm? Where on your head? Between your eyes or on your head? So there are biblical texts that are not clear, and there's going to be rabbinic readings of those texts to tell you the behavior. And those behaviors will come up, we call halacha, Jewish law. Jewish law, halacha, means to walk. It's to walk a path, or to take you on a path. That's what halacha is, Jewish law. Jewish law is designed to come to a consensus. Shalom, shalom. Shalom, shalom. So feel free to get some refreshments. Okay, good. So Jewish law is designed to come to a consensus, even though there's debate. And people will say, oh, to be Jewish is to argue. It's true, there are arguments. But when it comes to behavior, there is a desire to come to a conclusion where there is one Torah in Israel, where there's one mode of behavior. And when there was a high court, they resolved halachic dispute, and they came to a conclusion. There's a famous saying that they would say, when it came to different debates, though. They would say, these and these are the words of the living God. Shammai's words and Hillel words, they differ with one another. One says, for example, light the menorah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The other says, light the menorah, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So the Talmud would say, these and these are the words of the living God. They're both true, but the law is like Hillel. Law followed one, but the idea of a multiplicity of understandings of every text is central to Judaism. Even in law, the law that is rejected is still used as a springboard for moral and ethical and spiritual interpretations. How much more so when it comes to the biblical text itself? We say, like a hammer smashing a rock, it shatters into many pieces, or many sparks come out. The idea of multi-levels of meaning are intrinsic to the Jewish reading of a text. I can't say this enough. One of the ways to differentiate, when a Christian is reading a text and a Jew is reading a text, the Christian is reading everything as being a precursor to Jesus, for example. There's one meaning to the text. I'm oversimplifying, but in general, they're seen as one meaning. And many Jews who are reading a biblical text will want to know, okay, what's the real meaning? And even if you're a historian, you're going to say, okay, let me see how it was read in its original sense. What was the original intent of the author of this text? In Judaism, even if we do accept, we'll have to come back to that. Is there an original meaning? Is there a central meaning? Is there a main meaning? We'll come back to that discussion. But we for sure accept as a given that there are multiplicity of legitimate ways of reading the text. First, methodology. Jewish law is not the same as the interpretation of the biblical text as a narrative. In other words, there are Jewish laws that are derived from a biblical text that are not what we would call the simple meaning of the text. So Jewish law has its own rules. It's like somebody doing some excavation in my backyard. If I have a farmer, if I have an archaeologist, if I have a chemist, one person is going to find pollutants, another person is going to find, is this good for growing certain types of things? Someone else is going to find, Indian, Native American arrowheads. It's exact same dirt. You're using just different tools to analyze it. They are not the same, and there's a multiplicity of meaning. So I'm giving you the background just so as we go in. Some of this class, the first class that we're doing today, some of you may be familiar with. We did this class called Book Smart, which had basic genres of Jewish learning. So I used some of the slides from that course for just the overview. But then we'll delve in a little bit deeper. Okay, so what we have is, if you want to define the different types in rabbinic literature from the year about 200 BC to about 500 is the period of the Mishnah, the sages of the Mishnah, 200 BC to 200 of the Common Era, 80, those 400 years is about the Mishnah. The Talmud will be from about 200 till about 600. So that period from 200 BC till 600 is the period we call the sages. I'm gonna give you two different words, Razal or Chazal. These are acronyms. Razal means Rabosenu Zichrono Livracha, our teachers of blessed memory. Chazal stands for our sages of blessed memory. So Razal, Chazal, the rabbinic tradition that we consider to be in the traditional way of how Judaism sees itself, is that the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud are the conduit of the oral tradition, and they are the end of a period where there was consensus about these authors and these works. I'm on shaky ground here for a moment. The Talmud is canonized in a way. It's closed. The Mishnah is canonized. It's closed. Midrash, which are not just a methodology, but it's a whole bunch of different works. Midrash are of those rabbis of that period of 200 BC till 600. they are quoted in different collections of works. Some of those works are made earlier, let's say the year 500, or maybe even earlier 300. And some of them are compiled later, but from those same teachers. So these texts we call Midrash that are non-legal are not binding in a Jewish, because they're not legal texts, they're not binding in the same way, and there's a lot more flexibility. Because Judaism wants to have one mode of behavior, but it loved multiplicity of interpretation, it didn't feel a need to cut any, to reject any, and you sometimes end up with some that are not necessarily consistent with other ways of thinking. Sometimes you can have midrashim that are strange, outlandish, and there's a inclination at times to reject, oh, it's a strange midrash. Other times people saw those midrashim as having deeper dimensions. So midrash as bodies of work are varied. There are many different works of midrash. Some were part of the Jewish ecosystem for a longer period of time. They were copied from manuscripts, and people have multiple manuscripts of those original works. We can go back hundreds of years before the printing press and find copies of these works quoted by many other sages. That gives it what we would call a legitimacy, or midrashim that have a little more of a, they've been analyzed, they've been, the contradictions have been brought up, they've been attacked, and they've been defended. So they have a little more what we call legitimacy, not compared to the Talmud. The Talmud, because it's a legal body of work, it also includes, though, midrashic teachings, non-legal components of the Talmud. So if I would speak of midrash, it exists in the Talmud, it exists a little bit in the Mishnah, and it exists as independent works of midrash. And in the future classes, we'll talk about different bodies of work, and we will analyze, some of them. Each week, we're going to pick sections that are relevant to the Torah portion we're in. So this week is Shemos, the beginning of Exodus. So there's lots of rich midrashim. But going back for a minute, if I would speak of, in a general sense, in the Talmud, there's two types of literature: halacha, law, and agadah. Agadah would mean all the non-legal parts of the Talmud. Now, here's the challenge. The Talmud and the Midrashim will analyze biblical texts. Sometimes they're going to be doing a close reading of the text, and they're struggling to understand contradictions in the text, things that are missing, gaps in the text, right? Other times, they're using it as a springboard to give a sermon about the Romans who are attacking them, and how, don't worry, the Messiah will come and you'll be taken care of. Then they'll be taking biblical texts out of context at times to weave a sermon. So sometimes you'll have midrashim that seem fanciful. Other times they will seem like what we would call a very straight commentary on the biblical text. But you can't always tell. It doesn't tell you what sort of midrash it is. You can open up a midrash and it can either be a fanciful interpretation, or with a moral message. We'll get to that in a second. Or it can be a very literal interpretation that's resolving a problem in the text. But we have to separate these strands at times, and it's hard to know. And this is one of the great debates for the next 1,000 years, when you have different commentators. In this book, Masters of the Word, we have 3 volumes of it. We go through different genres of commentary. One of the things that they discuss is, okay, we believe that the sages of the Talmud are part of our tradition and they are respected, but does that mean that this interpretation is the base interpretation, the fundamental interpretation? Is it even meant as a literal interpretation? It's not always. this is an ongoing conversation. But the building blocks, and here's the key, I think. The building blocks of all of Jewish thought, philosophy, for the next 2,000 years, philosophy, law, Torah commentary, almost everything flows from these sages, the sages of Talmud, and by extension, the Midrash. That is the repository of the basic building blocks of how things develop. So we can't underestimate their value. The problem is they did not write works of linear translation and interpretation of the Bible. That would take another 1,000 years for people to do. We have translations, that is true, contemporary with the Talmud, which we'll get to in 6 weeks from now. We then have later translations, and we have interpretations. But the Talmud and Midrash is a mix of all different genres of interpretation. Okay. Any thoughts before we jump in? Okay, every introduction is just another introduction. This is what I feel like. It's a veil behind a veil behind a veil. All right.
Points of view that now are regarded as being heretical or periphery got moved to that position from where they may have started.
Okay, so when you have in the Midrash opinions that are seen as, let me back up. People say the Midrash says as if it is a one voice. The Midrash, by its definition, is a compilation of hundreds of rabbis. These are works that are made up of quotes of other people. It's not one. So we say the Midrash says. So there's many rabbis. The rabbis don't all have to agree with each other. In general, though, Judaism is not that into heresy hunting. What I mean to say is there are basics of fundamentals of belief, which we can debate what they are. But that's such a tiny strata of what Judaism is about. The arguments and debates are primarily about law and behavior. When it comes to describing heaven, they don't really mind if one person has a slightly different view of heaven. As long as you believe in reward and punishment in some way, and there is an afterlife, they're comfortable with that. What that afterlife looks like, they don't worry too much. Yes, you do, because of reward and punishment, there is a belief in an afterlife. This is not to say belief and dogma don't matter at all, but it's really not the focus of, there is a definition of someone who's a heretic. So you have to define, what does it mean, a heretic? So it's a legal conversation. How do you define a heretic? What's the minimal or the maximum, so to speak, of how much room is there? But it's a legal conversation. It's not like dogma and other religions, where the religions grow out of faith and the laws come out of the faith. It's the other way around. Our laws are in the Torah. We'll extract values from the law. Now, Midrash will give also voice to different values. In other words, sometimes they're going to use biblical texts to express values that they have, that they got from other readings of the Torah or their oral tradition, and they'll dress it up into a biblical story. And that biblical story that they're using may be a bit of a stretch for us going back. But this idea, though, of how things are rejected, I would say that's a process. So, for example, one of the big debates among historians today is, did any of these people, sages of that time, believe God had a body? Not a physical body, but a form. Because in the biblical text, you speak of God's arm and God's hand and God's different sitting on a throne. The basic understanding in general is they didn't. They did not have an anthropomorphical view of God. They understood these were symbols. And when the prophets or the Bible, the Torah, speaks of God sitting on a throne, it's a spiritual symbolism of something. It means something. But there are readers that would say, well, some of these people seem to have believed that, yes, there's some sort of spiritual contours or shape and all that. But I would say nowadays, Maimonides says, anyone who believes that is a heretic. He writes this, and in his code of law. And his commentator or critic known as the Ravid says, people greater and bigger than him understood it to mean literally. So when you read what he's saying there, the context seems to be what he's saying is that if someone reads the biblical text using their own mind and comes to a conclusion that God has a body, that's not heresy if it's based on a mistake of understanding. That's how the commentators understand this conversation. That once it was accepted as being, without question and discussed by the philosophers, that God doesn't have a form, so it's no longer acceptable. So that's one of those areas, just to go into that little minutia. Was there ever a time that Jews in the Talmudic era believed that God had a form of some sort? There are different Midrashic texts that talk about, God's arm being 500 years long. I mean, it's not typical Midrash. It's some of these outlying texts of that time period, which we're going to come back to. My point is, just to pull it together, I don't want to be going too far afield here. There are texts of that period that would seem to imply certain things that we would consider heretical today. And the understanding is, yes, these things could evolve in Judaism. There could have been a time where it hadn't been discussed and analyzed in depth in a way that the consensus is clear. The Jews do not believe that God has even a spiritual form. He is no form, no limitation, infinite in every direction. Okay? So there is that question of evolution, and historians, are interested in that a lot about that. But the traditional Jewish point of view would be that that there are certain themes that did evolve over time or were debated. I'll give you one other one. In the Talmud, there's a rabbi that says a physical Messiah is not going to come. It's going to be God himself. Because already the prophecies that speak of a physical Messiah was used up in the days of Hezekiah. The Talmud then says, may the bones rot of such a person who says such a thing. And he's totally bombarded by everyone. He's not saying there's no Messiah. He's saying that the biblical prophecies in Deuteronomy and other places will be fulfilled by God himself doing it. But he's like a minority opinion, and it's rejected in the Talmud. So you have that idea where we wouldn't consider him a heretic. We would consider him making a mistake in biblical interpretation. So, and this will lead us down some different paths in that. What we're going to discover is that there is room for my own understanding of the text as I look at the text, not just through the eyes of the sages. Then the question, though, is, do I have the tools to be able to do that? If I believe that the biblical text reflects, each piece reflects on the other, that means I have to have at least the knowledge of the 5 books of Moses backwards and forwards, and that my theories of interpretation should be consistent throughout the 5 books. This is working with the assumptions, traditional belief, that there's one author of the biblical text, and how much more so of the Tanakh. So what you'll discover is that people who created interpretations of the Tanakh, such as Rashi, as we'll discover, and others, had a system of interpretation that they applied over thousands of verses, and they had to be consistent. Otherwise, here's the thing, I'll do this inside, I think, but the biblical text is not seen as a blank canvas to paint our own interpretations on. The question becomes, though, at times, as we're going to see, the rabbis of that period, we'll call them the rabbis of the Midrash and the Talmud, from 200 BC till about 600, the Common Era, are using the Torah at times to illuminate and illustrate their values and ethics that they know from other places in the Torah. So in those cases, it won't be an exact interpretation. It will be using the text for their purposes, but they believe it's legitimate because it's not always a literal meaning. They find multiplicity of meaning, and they don't feel it's pushing anyone out. By taking one meaning is not pushing out another meaning. It's bringing in another interpretation, another layer, another level. It's not always literal. Sometimes it's a metaphor. When we're reading it, we have to be critical and figure out, wait, is this a literal meaning? Is this a metaphoric meaning? Is this an allegory? Is this about a political event happening right then in their time? What is its relevance for us today? All right, let me jump in with a bit of an overview of where we are. Okay, so any thoughts before we go on? And then we'll do some. Yes, good.
Quick question, but if it's not the right time, I don't want to derail us.
I am so derailed that you're going to be, no matter what, you're going to be good.
You mentioned the acceptance of the multiplicity of interpretation.
Yes.
But there was a desire and an emphasis on a unified behavior. I'm just curious as to why.
The definition of, if you read the Torah, the definition of the Torah as understood through the oral tradition is to tell you how to live your life. And God says you should go to the judge in your day if you have a question between blood and blood, between law and law, and you should determine. Every city should have 23 judges, and then there should be a high court of 70 judges. In other words, a system of justice, of law, which covers in Judaism every part of life, is only possible if there is a universal code. In other words, otherwise you'll end up with a multiplicity of nations. You'll have many different religions in Judaism. In other words, if everyone can decide, when is it okay to abort a fetus or to shoot your neighbor who's entering breaking into your house, right? There is no law. It's chaos. So the same way you wouldn't want in America, it's a fundamental that that the Torah is a law-based system. So you need to have centralized authority. The question really is the other way, I would think. Why did they leave so much room for interpretation outside of law? But law is fundamental. You can't have. Law doesn't work with multiplicity. If there's everyone's their own judge, jury, and executioner, that's anarchy. That's not justice. It doesn't work as a system. But even the understanding of it was that it was designed by having Moses. You see in the stories of the Bible, when he doesn't know something, he asks God. And then, there is that system set up where God tells them how to do that. But they don't see the same necessity when it comes to biblical interpretation because A, it's going to be applicable at all times and all places, which means I should be able to derive new meaning, new messages that resonate more with me right now. On the other hand, the behavior we are going to want to be universal or somehow what's the word for it in English? Consistent and a system. But I would say these understandings that I'm giving is part of the oral tradition as well, which leads us to some of the other elements. Some of the stuff you guys may be familiar with, and then again, feel free to interject, please. Okay, so what we have first is the word Torah is confusing because the exact same word is used for many different things. The 5 books of Moses, the parchment scroll, is one term for it. Excuse me, sorry. And also, any Jewish literary work compiled through history, we say, I'm studying Torah, because it's based on the Torah. That's the challenge. Torah, which one is it? You have Torah as a specific scroll, both the Torah scroll, but we want to say that there are 2 articulations in the same body of wisdom and knowledge. There is a difference in sanctity between them, of course. The 5 books we see as being dictated by God to Moses. So you have a Torah scroll, and then you have general Torah. So the Torah scroll is traditionally 5 books of Moses written over 40 years in the Sinai desert. That's a traditional approach to the 5 books of Moses, about 300,000 letters, each one, including Deuteronomy in the end, written by Moses in the desert. General Torah, be hundreds of thousands of writing, written over 3,300 years in all corners of the world, is what we would call Torah books, Torah library, Torah wisdom. So the written Torah the idea is that the text cannot be changed. In addition, every letter is significant, and it includes the 24 books of the Tanakh. So there's also another element of Torah, which we call the oral Torah. The oral Torah is, and this is, again, a question of debate, and we're not going to deal with every element of it, but the Torah itself cannot be understood without some level of interpretation. As we're going to see, I'll give a few examples here. The question becomes, how much of this interpretation is transmitted by God to Moses, and how much of it is created by the rabbis? The rabbis meaning 200 BC till about 600 of the Common Era. These sages, Chazal, Razal, Talmud, and they're also in the Midrash, although the Midrash are not all legal writings, so therefore they have less of a binding. But the issue is that the oral Torah includes tools of interpretation as well. Now, these tools of interpretation help you derive law, but when applied more liberally, can help you extrapolate and pull out layers and layers of meaning from every single text in the Torah. Not legal. In other words, the legal is going to be much more narrow about its system, how it works. But what we're going to be doing is, let's say, reading biblical stories and biblical narrative. Many of these same types of principles, there are 13 principles you read about every morning in our prayers of biblical interpretation. But when it comes to reading Midrash, there's 32 rules of interpretation. We'll look at some of these rules. Some of them are very logical ones that the Torah itself uses in many places. You see that the biblical text will sometimes use some of these tools to explain an idea. And these ideas have then been taken by the later sages and applied. But originally, the oral Torah is going to be, originally was forbidden to be written down and include all the teachings that come after the 24 books of the Tanakh. The Tanakh this is the book that you have here. This is the Tanakh, 24 books of the Bible. And this is the 5 books, the Chumash. Chumash comes from the word 5, because Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are 5 books. So the 5 books of the Torah are called Chamisha Chumshei Torah. The 5 books, and I think in Greek they say Pentateuch, which would be 5. So that is the Chumash. And this is, as we're going to see, the Tanakh, the 24 books. So here we have them. So the Torah was designed originally, though, in 2 distinct formats. I was saying, for example, shake a little of an etrog. The Torah says, take the beautiful fruit. What that beautiful fruit is, we don't know. It is rather a tradition that tells us it is a citron fruit. Take the palm tree branch, that we know. Take the hadas, and the other one is eitz avos, the trees that grow in clumps, which is the willow. But the point is what these trees are. Many of them you need to just have a tradition to say what they are. So the Torah, though, is designed to exist in 2 formats: books and people. Okay, here are the 24 books of Tanakh. We're not going to go through all of them now, but it's going to help us. Even though these are written over 1,000 years, but nevertheless, they still are seen as, in the Midrashic eyes, as talking to one another. So the 24 books include 3 main sections: Torah, the 5 books of Moses, prophets, and Ksuvim, writings. The difference between the writings and the prophets is not that simple. The prophets and the writings, King Solomon is seen to have written some of the writings. King David is seen as some of the writings, but his works are also in the books of prophets. But the point is, there are these 3 different sections that you can look in your Tanakh. We'll have those sections. So what is it? It includes really the seeds of all of Jewish learning that comes afterwards. History, ethics, philosophy, law, all included in the Tanakh. But it's something more than that. It is seen as being the Word of God. Either the first 5 books, the Word of God literally, that he dictates to Moses, and the other books as either by prophetic vision or inspired. So the word Torah literally means a guide towards life. That's what it means, Horah. And the mitzvot of the Torah are the do's and don'ts of life. So if you would say, what is the core of Torah for the traditional Jew? It was the law, the behavior. That was the core. That's the first and foremost, the thing that has to get done first. The whys come afterward, if you will. And the whys are many layers of meaning. If someone says, why do I keep kosher? Well, because God said so in the Torah. But what's the benefit of it? You'll have many different interpretations about kosher. It sets you aside from the different peoples of the earth. No. The Jewish soul is nurtured by having kosher food. It's the special energy that will make you more refined. no, there's different ethical messages of not eating milk and meat. Meat is, you got to take life to have meat, and milk gives life. It's to make you sensitive to that. There are many, many layers of interpretation. First and foremost, God said so. The whats are law. The whys are Jewish thought, our ethics, our interpretation, where there's a lot more room for a multiplicity of meaning. So the why, you don't like this why, I have another why. But you don't like this what, and I can't help you. If you have another law, then you have another religion in Judaism. If you have another why, that's another interpretation. As long as you recognize that God gave it to us, you're on the same page. You have a new interpretation. Okay, maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. Depends who you are, depends your track record, how good it is. But it's okay. The door of interpretation has never been closed. Okay. Yes.
The oral Torah was spoken to Moses.
Some of it is told to Moses, like right away, anything according to tradition, when God says to Moses, you shall slaughter an animal like I showed you, that says that in the biblical text. I mean, he had to show him how to slaughter an animal because it doesn't say anywhere in the biblical text how to slaughter an animal. And Jews have never argued about how to slaughter an animal. In other words, there are whole segments of Judaism no one argues about. And the understanding was that, oh, we have it from this tradition that God told Moses. You should take an etrog. He doesn't say etrog, he says a beautiful fruit. So the understanding is in the tradition that we've always known what it was given. However, God also gave Moses rules of interpretation to extrapolate. A simple rule, for example, is follow the majority when those who are deriving the rules have a disagreement. So when you have a high court, you follow the majority. It's a simple rule that you don't follow the smartest one, you follow the majority. It's a logical rule, but it's a rule that's seen in the biblical text as referring to when there is dispute. In other words, there's room for human interpretation based on principles of interpretation that they believe are transmitted by Moses, but the partnership of man in developing these interpretations were very much human creations. So the simple, again, I'm oversimplifying, areas where they don't argue about the text. So for example, I'll give you one example. The Torah says, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Judaism, traditional Judaism, has always understood this to mean do not eat milk and meat together, do not cook milk and meat together, and do not get pleasure from milk and meat that was cooked together. That means don't sell it and get benefit from it. The biblical text doesn't say that. It says don't cook a goat in its mother's milk. The Talmud has a whole bunch of different arguments about where do you find this law that Jews keep, not to cook it, not to eat it, any type of meat and milk, not chicken, chicken's a different story. Any type of meat that has milk, any sort of animal that gives milk should not be cooked with meat, even if it's not its mother, brother, or sister. Meat with milk should not be cooked or eaten or sold. They find different biblical texts, a whole bunch of different ones, as allusions, as hooks, to find using modes of biblical interpretation. But this is not the source for the law. They understand that the source, the law, exists independent of the linkage to the biblical text. That's why there's a whole multiplicity of different sources that people bring. Nowadays, it's common, people know, oh, it says 3 times in the Torah, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. So those 3 times alludes to don't cook it, don't eat it, don't have pleasure of it. But in the Talmud, the source of the debate has many different approaches because they're not looking for a source of the law. They're looking for a way to link it to the biblical law. So the understanding in Judaism, not chicken, leaving aside chicken, meat and milk, traditional Judaism understood it was always forbidden, even though the Torah only says a kid in its mother's milk. And there was an oral tradition. Later on, rabbis used the methods of biblical interpretation to find its source. And a big debate in traditional Judaism and today will be, when is a law at times derived from the text? And when is it a transmitted law that finds allusions in the text? Let's say going back to the etrog. The etrog is a citron fruit. It's called in the Torah hadar, beautiful. So one interpretation is, wait, how is I understand that you're telling me an etrog is a citron fruit, but how is it alluded to in the word hadar, beautiful? I mean, a watermelon, a pomegranate, other fruit might be called beautiful. Okay, maybe a watermelon doesn't grow on a tree, but there are many fruits that might be considered beautiful. Why this one? So one interpretation says hadar, the word hadar, is related to the word dar, to live. This is a fruit that lives on the tree from season to season, from year to year. You can leave an etrog on its tree and it'll keep on growing bigger and bigger. And it grows from every season. That's one interpretation. Another one is related to the ancient Greek word hydra, water, because it needs a lot of water. Now, whether ancient Greek was a language at the time when the biblical text was written, according to the rabbis, is a matter of discussion. But it's clear they're looking for allusions and connections to an existing interpretation that already existed. What we're going to find in Midrash, there are two sources of law in the Tanaic period. Tanaic period meaning from 200 BC till 200 of Common Era. The Mishnah is 6 orders of 60 tractates of law, without sources, different opinions, and if there's dispute. Otherwise, how you light Shabbat how you keep Shabbat, how you read the Megillah, how you shake a lulav, right? All these different, how should a lulav of an etrog be held? How should it be bound? The Mishnah does not have sources. However, there's a genre of Midrash of the same period where the rabbis wrote works on the biblical text where they derive from the biblical text all the laws. How do you bring a paschal sacrifice? So in the Mishnah, it just says the laws. In the Midrash, called the Mechilta, I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but the Midrash on Exodus will describe, based on the biblical text, they will derive the different laws. So there's a debate, and the answer is not clear. What came first? Was there an oral tradition that the sages of the Mishnah are conversing about? Or are they, what percentage of it are they deriving themselves from the biblical text? Or was it given from Moses already with this idea of linkage to biblical text? See, here's one thought. If you look at the story in the Bible, 40 years of the Jews in the desert, Moses is teaching them Torah before they have scrolls. The scrolls are not written down seemingly until the end of the sojourn in the desert. When Moses, the first of the 10 commandments are oral. They go on Mount Sinai and God says, you shall have no other gods aside from me. There's no text given. Moses goes up 40 days and 40 nights, comes down with the tablets and breaks them. They have no tablets yet. He goes up again, brings down the second tablet. But then there's a whole bunch of laws in the Torah that are not written down. Moses is first teaching the Torah orally. Everything he does is verbal initially. It is later, once it's written down, that things get linked to the text. So this argument is there already is an oral tradition of how to do things as they're being commanded. You find in the Torah, this guy didn't keep the Sabbath. Well, the Torah wasn't given. The biblical scrolls are not written down yet, but they had laws of the Sabbath. God told them the 10 Commandments. Or in Murrah earlier, there's also God tells them laws at different times. So what you have here is you have two different genres of work. Midrash means to derive from the text. So there's sometimes deriving, there are legal types of Midrash, and then there are Agadic. Agadah means anything that's not legal. All right, let's go a bit further, and then feel free to interject, just because there's many different terms here that, as we go further, we'll take a closer look at them. So, if you look at the divine communication of Tanakh, the understanding is that the 5 books of Moses is God speaks to him face to face, and he actually dictates the Torah to him. Another level is God to the prophets, and then we have like a vision, I'll make known to them. And then we're going to have the writings, which are inspiration. So the 613 commandments are seen as contain the 5 books of Moses. Everything else in the Tanakh, all the prophets and the ethical writings do not teach us one bit about Jewish law. Or there's no commandments in them that are binding. They are moral and spiritual messages about the future and about how to behave, in other words, in specific times and situations, wisdom literature, but the laws are the 5 books. That's one of the principles. As a rule, and sometimes there are seeming contradictions, and then we'll have to deal with that. But the prophets neither subtracted nor added to what's written in the Torah, because that would make them a false prophet. In other words, in order for Judaism to last, you couldn't have it constantly being amended and changed by prophets. You could have courts interpreting the law or legislating new law, which we would be like rabbinic law, like making up Hanukkah or Purim, are new laws. But they're not claiming that God commanded it. They're rather saying that based on the authority vested in us as the high court, God gives the right for the high court to institute new laws. They were both a legislative body and an interpretive body. So, but they don't claim, no one could come along and say, God told me we should keep Hanukkah. If you did that, you were a false prophet. If you came along, God said we should no longer keep kosher, you were a false prophet. Otherwise, we're not going to get into the parameters of a prophet, but whatever a prophet was would give him the power to overrule. If he could tell you to go to war, or if he could tell you, this person should be deposed as king, if he could tell you get rid of the Torah, you wouldn't have a Torah anymore. All you need is a new guy to show up and say, we're no longer keeping the Torah. Now it's a spirit. It's no longer the law in the flesh. Now it's going to be the law of the spirit, and we're done with physical laws. Then you would have no religion left. So in other words, the Torah explicitly says, do not listen to a prophet that comes and tries to take you away from keeping the Torah. You all saw how God spoke to Moses at Sinai. You all heard, you all witnessed it. It was something unique. The giving of the 10 Commandments, that all of the Jewish people together witnessed it. So no one could come along and tell you that didn't happen. So whatever Moses taught you is binding, even the rest of the 5 books, even though you only heard the 10 Commandments, because you all trust Moses. That's what God says in Exodus. Okay, so I don't want to get too many details here, but rules of prophets, what they do is they tell individuals or get people to repent. They would warn them of future calamity and to provide hope with divine promises of future salvation. That's what prophets did. They were the inspiration. So if you think about it, Midrash, that's non-halachic, is more in the family of the prophets. You're interpreting Torah with moral, ethical messages, visions for the future, visions about reward and punishment, about the punishment of the wicked and the reward of the righteous, how to get through difficult times, reading the story of Joseph to teach you how to have faith, reading the story of the Exodus from Egypt that teaches us, how miracles happen, etc. So in other words, that's what prophets do. There are different levels of revelation, and the level, we would say, that for the writings, we call it divine inspiration. God spoke in me and his word is on my tongue. It's not the same as seeing a vision. It's seen in general as being slightly less, but it's all seen, at least for purposes of the Midrash, as being able to interpret from one to another. So you have Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim. All 3 sections are Tanakh and the forms of divine revelation. Okay, so we're going to read a few texts that I printed out. Make sure, see what time it is here. I know the preliminary takes longer than I expected. Okay. So the secular approach, I have it on the screen, but it's probably too small, that the Hebrew Bible is a collection of books like any other, created and put together by normal, fallible human beings. And they'll say the Hebrew Bible is inconsistent because it derives from different sources that do not always agree, and individual books are multi-layered and grow over time. So not just the books themselves don't talk to each other, each book grew on its own. They'll say the Hebrew Bible is a document of its time, best interpreted in its original historical context. And finally, the Hebrew Bible is an ideologically driven collection of texts. It's not objective and neutral about any of the topics it treats. And historical books are not historical in our sense. That's the academic approach today. The traditional Jewish approach assumes the Torah is factually and morally true, It's qualitatively different from all other books that's revealed or inspired by God. So every detail of the biblical text is significant. And additionally, the text is cryptic and has many layers of meaning. Interpretation is necessary. On the other hand, it's harmonious and perfect, and consistencies are only apparent. And number 4, a big one, eternally true. It's speaking to and about us. Its meaning is not bound by any historical context, nor is historically conditioned. Hence, Jews could find guidance in the Tanakh's words hundreds, even thousands of years after they've been written.
This axiomatic assumptions?
These are axiomatic. I mean, in a sense of this,
Okay.
in other words, we could talk about why this is so and where God says that in the Bible. This is the starting point of the traditional approach. Again, we could spend time analyzing each one of these things, but where they come from, where they go from. For the intents and purposes of this class, I'm saying this is the traditional approach as it exists. How it evolved and where it came from and why this is so is a little more. Each one of these things can be taken apart and parsed a little bit more. But for sure, in other words, the approach of all the sages and all the interpreters and all of how Jews have read the biblical text for the last thousands of years, pre-emancipation, in other words, traditional readings of the biblical text were based on this premise. Who wrote which one, which book, and all that they can discuss and debate, but they all believe they're written by prophets and that they were actually canonized by a group of prophets and sages at the beginning of the Second Temple period. Okay, so just for example, Elijah and I were looking at a song in the book of, what was it? In the book of, wasn't Devorah's song?
Looking at the sea.
The Red Sea, but we also looked at it in the prophets as well, a song. You asked him why. But either way, this is the Red Sea.
Song?
It was a song. King David says a song. It was King David's song in Samuel. And this is the Song of the Sea. This is 1,000 years. This is from about 1,000 years ago. Now, here's the challenge. Parchment doesn't last that long. The only reason we have the Dead Sea Scrolls is because they were put in jugs in a dry desert. It's an anomaly. Otherwise, you wouldn't have it. It would fall apart. The issue is, for traditional Judaism, these texts before a printing press were kept, that we know of, evidence-based, many different communities, and every word is held sacred. The biblical text is read publicly, every portion of the 5 books of Moses out loud. If someone reads it wrong, there's going to be a few people in the synagogue going, telling you how to pronounce it, how to read it. Even if you're the bar mitzvah boy and you practice for half a year, they're not going to have mercy on you. Why? Not just because they're grumpy old men and this is their pleasure, but because the part of the transmission of the biblical text is the accuracy of its reading, its pronunciation, and its letters. And if a scribe can make a mistake in one of 300,000 letters, and if there's a mistake, they're going to pick it up because it's read publicly. The person reading it will pick it up, and maybe the people hearing it will pick it up. And then there are all sorts of laws, what you have to do until the scroll is fixed. You're not allowed to keep a scroll that has a mistake in it in your home. In some synagogues, they'll put a belt around it. But even that's traditionally problematic because you do not want bad versions to get around. Now, Jews that were separated for 1,000 years from one another, in Yemen, for example, cut off from the rest of the Jewish world, their Torah scrolls of 300,000 letters are exactly the same as ours. 5 letters different that don't change any meaning. Just in Hebrew, vowels can sometimes be taken the place of by letters, like a vav makes an O sound or things like that. So there are 5 or 6 or 7 different, I think it's 5, differences in Yemenite Torah scrolls for all other Jews. And they were isolated from us for 1,000 years. In other words, and there are hundreds of scrolls written in all these places. Every Torah scroll is read publicly. Each one is read and checked meticulously. We are obsessed with the accuracy of our text. Just to give a comparison, there's not one version of the New Testament as far as scrolls go, as far as pre-printing press goes, that doesn't have a variation in a text, in a verse. Every verse has variations. Forget about a couple 100,000 letters. Now, the critics would say, well, only since you only have 1,000 years, that's all you have. But if Our tradition tells us it's been the same text going all the way back. And the argument that we may have, and there was a recognition that there was this text, and the text was translated from, the Septuagint and others, which we'll get to. But the fact that we kept it even 500 years before the printing press, in other words, 500 years in isolated places, tells us it's possible. Whether the academics or the critics want to buy that it was done is another conversation, but for sure possible. We've done this with a written text and been meticulous about it. And Midrash works on the premise that every letter matters. Every letter has interpretation. So whenever they're discussing the meaning, how it's spelled even has relevance. So they're all talking about every letter of this omni-significant text. That is part of the entire transmission. So if you look at the C, it's the one all the way on the right, all the way on the left here, it's made in brick form. You see those letters? This is 1,000 years ago. And Torah scroll, this one is about from 1155. And exact same, it just scrolled over 2 columns over, but it's exact same format. Az Yasher Moshe. And any Jewish child today can read this, even though there are no vowels and punctuation, if the child knows the Hebrew. Exact same text. There's no vowels, no punctuation. You know why? We want layers and levels of meaning. That's one of the reasons why there isn't. But also because God didn't transmit it with vowels and punctuation in the text, but it's part of the oral tradition, as we'll see, going back to the earliest reading of the text. It had to be read with vowels, or it wouldn't make sense. There are no vowels in the Hebrew. So you have to have vowels, and many words can be read different ways. The Hebrew word for morning is what? How do you say good morning in Hebrew? Boker tov. How do you say cattle in Hebrew? Bakar. Spelled the exact same way, just there's different punctuation. Now, some things you can pick up from context, but there are many others you can't. How do you say milk in Hebrew? Chalav. How do you say forbidden fat? Chalev. So do not cook a goat in its mother's forbidden fat could have been a literal interpretation, but nobody ever said that. Today, modern academics may say that because they could. But I'm just saying traditional Judaism never said that. It always was a kid in its mother's milk. Okay, so the nature of this oral Torah, this is what Marty touched on. We have here this idea that it says that Scripture, Mishnah, Talmud, and Agadah. Agadah is the Midrashic writings. Even what a proficient student is destined to innovate, we're already said to Moses Sinai. What does this mean? Does it mean literally? Did Moses say everything that was ever, did God tell Moses everything that was going to be said? You could believe that. There are those that said Moses had a prophetic vision and God showed him, uploaded it into his mind, an image of everything that would be said. He had an experience. It wasn't intellectual. That's not the common understanding. The common understanding is God doesn't have to tell Moses everything. He gives him the principles of interpretation. So let's see what he says here. In other words, let's see if I have the screen for it. We know that the written Torah is scripture, and the oral Torah is a much later time period. It goes down until, let's say, the year 600. We call them the sages of the oral tradition. So how does that fit into line? So we say, let's see if we have it. We're all teachings given, here it should be here. There's still constant innovation. So we say everything's created with the original source and requires a special environment to develop and grow. And the Torah is a partnership. And these partnerships are the rules of interpretation. So the belief is that Moses got certain rules of interpretation we're going to study in future weeks. Some of those rules of interpretation, some of them are fairly, simple. Others are more detailed. Okay, so let's take a look. So every part of Torah is a collaboration, divine revelation, and human intellect. The written Torah, a lot of this stuff is the overview, and I'm sorry, I just had more of it than I thought. I just think it's important as we go for all the next 30 classes to have just a framework. So divine revelation is more dominant, while human involvement is secondary in the written Torah. The written Torah is God talking to Moses. The 5th book is Moses' speech to the Jewish people. So there's more of human element than the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments is God speaking directly to the Jewish people. That's more God than human. Then you have God telling Moses the first 4 books, he dictates it. So there's a little more human involved because Moses is now the transmitter to the people. So there's an extra layer. The 5th book is Moses' own words that God tells him to write down. Okay. The oral Torah is God gives the human mind and gives us the ability and gives us the right and gives us the obligation to use our mind with his tools to understand his will. Does that mean we can make a mistake? Sure it does. That's God's will too. That's the understanding of how Jewish law develops and how much of Torah interpretation does. Doesn't mean everything I say will be right. My peers are going to disagree. It has to be peer review for it to be able to see. We say there are 70 faces to the Torah. Well, there could be 70 backsides as well. Just because there are 70 facets in Hebrew, faces and facets are the same, maybe related as well. But there are 70 faces, but I could also be wrong. I could be making up something. I could be treating it like a blank canvas to paint my thoughts on. So I would just say, and this is a delicate balance when it comes to the non-legal. The legal is much more simple. There's a system there. But the non-legal is room for our own interpretation, and one just has to make sure it's consistent with the other values of Judaism. It's not seen as a blank canvas to paint on, in particular, if there are things that contradict the rest of the Torah. It has to be consistent with those values. So who I'm going to accept an interpretation from, someone says a good thought, could be accept the truth from anybody. A broken clock can be right twice a day, or maybe even more than that. Maybe the person's brilliant and has great insight, but I'm going to be circumspect about taking interpretations in that may play around with fundamentals of faith. So we want to just make sure there's a consistency there. But there's a lot of room. It's porous. There's a lot of conversation that can go when it comes to biblical interpretation over the ages. Okay. So one of the elements is the oral Torah is always linked to the written Torah because since every word has that level of significance, so it allows it, so to speak, to be parsed. The oral Torah, on the other hand, it's oral communication. It's not as meticulous about the words, more about the concepts. I'm saving this out. It's not relevant. Okay. I would like to do some readings. Could always do that a little bit later. All right. So the necessity of an oral Torah, one of the great examples is fasting Yom Kippur. It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah fast. It says you shall afflict yourself. What does that mean? The oral Torah understands it to mean fasting. Kosher slaughter, I mentioned, as I have commanded you. Where did he command us? Doesn't show anywhere in the Torah. God had to tell Moses. That's seen as an oral tradition. Tefillin and mezuzot, how they should be placed, where they should be placed, all that is seen as being oral Torah. The Shema, everyone says it, but it's not clear what these boxes are, how they should be written what should be written on the doors. But everyone understands what a mezuzah and tefillin are. So in the Dead Sea Scrolls from about 2,000 years ago, they uncovered tefillin with the same Torah portions that we have in the same format. Now, the groups there were not traditional. There were different, in the Second Temple period, there were many different groups of Jews. It wasn't just Rabbinic Judaism. And the people who were in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's different debate who they were. Was this a library? If someone walked into my room, into this house, and checked my library to see what I believed, there's a lot of heretical works here that they would think, okay, this is not an Orthodox home, because a library doesn't necessarily define everything that you believe. You collect books. Now, if someone once said to the Rebbe, there was a very anti-Israeli journalist, and he wrote anti-Israel stuff. And he came to the Rebbe, Lubavitcher Rebbe, a friend brought him, and he was known as a very effective writer. And the Rebbe said to him, I read your work. And he says to the Rebbe, why do you read my work? Do you agree with me in any way? He goes, Rebbe said, if I read only what I agree with, I'd read very little. You know, if you're going to be so anyway, that story, the Rebbe pushed him in different ways to use his talents in good ways, and he changed somewhat in his life. It's an interesting story of its own. But the point is, the Dead Sea Scrolls is big debate. Is this a library? Is it just Essenes? Is it different groups? Because there are different things there. However, the biblical texts that are there are 99% exactly like we have today, even though these were not necessarily, some of the stuff being buried may have been what we would consider buried for a reason. You know, maybe they were buried because they were not the perfect scrolls, etc. But many of the things are exactly the same as we have today. So it's just one example of tefillin. And in Masada, you have, this was also amazing, you have a mikvah. A mikvah is a ritual bath that was used there, whether it was originally by King Herod's time or a little bit later. This mikvah in Israel, there weren't many mikvahs because people used the ocean. In other words, in Eastern Europe, you needed to build a ritual bath using rainwater, and it had very specific rules. But these rules are interpreted from the Talmud, not even the Talmud, from the Mishnah, because there is no tractate of Talmud for mikvah. So Jews extrapolated from the Mishnah how to build these mikvahs that we have today all over urban areas. There are mikvahs. In Masada, in Israel, there are very few mikvahs in Israel. You have in Jerusalem for the priests, and you have in Masada, and they uncovered this one in Masada, and these rabbis who were experts in mikvah came in and measured it and said, this is a perfect mikvah according to our understanding today in the year 1950, 1960, whatever it was, 1950. In other words, these laws and traditions that were theoretical were transmitted in such a way that they were consistent with archaeological finds of the past. Interesting element. This is just to show, though, how you have these elements of this oral tradition that existed outside of physical, tangible things. They were in Europe or wherever it was. Okay, in the biblical text, it does speak of, in the biblical text, the existence of an oral tradition. It seems, this is again the interpretation of the rabbis, that in the written text, there is allusions to the oral tradition. Not just logically there has to be when it comes to fast days and tefillin and everything else, but God says, these are the Torahs that I gave you. Or that it says, God says in verse 14, he commanded to teach you statutes and ordinances. He told you his covenant, which he commanded to do, the 10 commandments. And they told you, in other words, he taught me at that time to teach you laws, to do them. And then here we have the authority of the high court, that if something is too difficult for you in Deuteronomy, you should go to the court in the temple and to the judge in those days, and he'll tell you what to do. This is the idea of a high court that would take place in the Temple Mount. First, right here, Deuteronomy chapter 17. If a matter elude you in judgment between blood and blood, between judgment and judgment, you shall rise and go to the place the Lord your God chooses, which is seen as the Temple Mount. That's a phrase used, hamakom asher yivchar lo Elokim. The place that God will choose, that is the term used for what will ultimately be Jerusalem. Hamakom, it's the place used, the same term used for the binding of Isaac. So according to Jewish tradition, the Temple Mount is the same place where Abraham bound Isaac, but it is seen as this is the place that God will choose for the temple. And you should do according to the law they instruct you, according to the judgment they say to you, you shall do. Do not divert from the word they tell you, either right or left. So a midrashic interpretation is, even if they tell you your right is left and your left is right, you shall obey them. Even if you think they're wrong, even if you know they're wrong, the only way law works is obedience to the law. In other words, the only way a system of law, a high court rules some way, if every individual could say, I'm an objector, I don't accept the rule of law, then you're not going to have law anymore. You have anarchy. So even a sage who thinks he knows better has to follow the law. You got to do what the law is. You could try to change the law by debating and discussing with them, but ultimately there's a system that has to have some sort of binding nature. That is the understanding of that. Okay, I'm leaving that aside. let's go here. I'm going further. Okay, Midrash. What is Midrash? Is it a particular set of books or a series of books or a certain style of teaching? It's both. Both. It's a bunch of books. The word Midrash means to seek out. Now, the understanding is that in the Torah, it includes the potential for all the future interpretations. It's there, and if you use the system right, you can derive these things from it. That's the understanding. It expounds on layers of meaning encoded in every verse of the written Torah. So basically, though, I'm skipping these timelines. The legitimacy of an interpretation is really based somewhat on authority. Who is an authority? Now, everyone has a right to interpret, but for it to be binding in some way, as seen as having a layer of, say, gravitas, but of acceptance by the community, a lot of it had to do with who said it and where it was said. So if it was said in the Talmud had a greater level of legitimacy because it was accepted across the board, it was edited, and all Jews accepted because it included law in it. However, there were many different works by the same sages that have a lesser level of how could I put it, authority. What's the difference really? The difference would be, in some degree, if something seems strange, how much do I try to make sense of the things that seem a little bit, not typical, a little bit maybe on the edge of heresy. If it's in the Talmud, I'm going to struggle to make sense of it. If it's other things, I may not bother. So this is a basic understanding of these genres of teachings that exist. There are mountains, so to speak, although, today it's a limited amount that we have. In other words, there's, like, say, 10 major works of Midrash that we have today. But the point is, each one of these things will include a multiplicity of types of teachings. Okay, let's take a look here. Two categories of Midrash. One is halachic Midrash, and sorry, you're the only one that didn't get one. Look at that. One is halachic Midrash, and the other is agadic, moral, philosophical, mystical teachings, as well as stories and parables and narratives. So let's see what time it is. I'll go drop further before we do a reading. I'm going to skip to, in the reading, we'll do a Midrash from this week's Torah portion. But in types of Midrashim, you have legal exposition, historical narratives, moral and ethical, philosophical, parables, Torah commentary. We're going to be focusing primarily on Torah commentary. In other words, what we're going to be doing in these weeks as we go ahead is how the sages read the Chumash as Torah commentary. So the term Midrash is applied to teachings quoted by the sages of the Mishnah and Talmudic period from 100 to 500. See, it's really edited to about 600, but the sages themselves, the last ones that are quoted, are the 500 period, but it's edited to about 600. Let's go a bit further. Okay. Okay, here we go. I'm going to say this out loud, and then we can do a reading side. What bothered the rabbis who are doing biblical interpretation? Number one is textual concerns. Number one is the idea of omnisignificance, the idea that every detail of Torah has meaning. Any repetition has to have a reason for it. That means much more than a modern close reading of a text would do. Because a modern close reading of the text, a lot of times you'll say it's grammatical, it's a usage, it's how people talk. But the sages, in their reading, found meaning in everything. And they found spiritual meaning, even in things that you might consider to be poetic. They found in every expression, they found a meaning. So number one is every word, every letter, every jot and tittle, as the expression goes, has meaning. Okay. Gap filling. Gap filling is a dangerous game. Mind the gap, as they say in England. But the issue of the gap is the Torah is missing parts of the story. You read about Abraham, he doesn't show up till he's 75 years old. So the sages fill in the gap. So the way they fill in the gap at times is with traditions that they have. These traditions may not be agreed upon by all the rabbis. They'll have different readings of the text. Sometimes they'll find it from the text itself. Other times it looks like it's a fanciful reading that might be seen as maybe a spiritual teaching rather than a factual teaching. We don't always know when we read the rabbinic text, but for our purposes, we're going to try to, the rabbinic texts that are linked directly to the biblical text, you can see which ones are closer to commentary and which ones are closer to maybe being a parable or something like that. It's not always clear. I'm going to do some today that will help you see these different types. So filling in the gaps. And then here's the big one, dialogue between distant verses. So, modern reading strategies look at how words, how the context, very close related. But our sages see the entire 24 books as hyperlinked, and they'll find meaning in another verse as a springboard that will illuminate a text far away. They don't see a problem with that. One shedding light on the other, even if it's taken a bit out of context. Also, they resolve contradictory verses. The Bible sometimes contradicts itself, or at least appears to. So sometimes you'll resolve the contradiction. Sometimes you'll harmonize. You'll find a third text. This is one of the famous biblical verses, the famous biblical rules of interpretation, that v'chein shnei ksuvim, two verses, hamachishim zeh zeh, that contradict one another, until the third principle comes and reconciles it. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis is one of the basic rules of biblical interpretation. And this is part of the, what do you call it again? It's a part of the 13 principles. It's the last of the 13 principles of biblical interpretation we read every day in prayers, and that's why I knew it by heart. Okay. Then they'll also make linguistic connections, that the language is being used, the same word is being used in different places. They're going to find a parallel to that. Last, which is more problematic, sometimes ideological concerns. Sometimes they're going to use the biblical text as a springboard to talk about different ideas, God, ethical and social positions, political positions about the ruling powers of the day, what we would call a sermon. So, and these sermons are recorded. Now, was this sermon meant to be understood as a biblical interpretation for all time? Not necessarily. Do we see it as a level of a true interpretation? Yes. Might it be in a context? Yes. Do we always know? No. Will there be debate among later sages? Should we take this literally or not? That will be part of a debate at times. Okay. Let's take a look at reading. I know we'll come back to this, but on it's reading number, did I delete this? 1 second. I thought I had one from Maimonides, a good reading. Oh, maybe I deleted it. Yeah, I deleted it because I'm saving for another time. Okay, let's go to okay. Let's see what we have time for. So the Haggadah is a form of Midrash. Everyone knows the Haggadah. The Haggadah is a rabbinic Midrash, full of rabbinic Midrash. We're not going to study it right now, but we'll use it next few weeks as a springboard. I want to go to this week's Torah portion, which is Sota 12a, which is reading number 13, for a minute. Let's go and also let's open up our biblical books, the 5 books, the Chumash, to